My name is Miguel, and I want you to listen while I tell you everything I remember from the years the river seemed to take our children, because I was there, and I will not look away. At first it was whispers, then missing boys, then bodies found on riverbanks, and the whole town folded inward with fear, as if silence could hold us safe. The disappearances started in 1989 and stretched into 1993, taking boys between 8 and 14, and the wounds we found on some bodies froze us with horror. I remember the way mothers gathered at dusk, their saris knotted in their hands, calling names into the dark, while fathers lit torches that trembled in the same light. We began to suspect that something rotten had grown in our region, rumors naming a sect, a name no one wanted to say loud in the market, because fear multiplies when it is spoken. Bodies that washed up or were found in hidden places were sometimes naked, castrated, and burned, with injuries so clinical we wondered who could cut like that. People talked about strange rites, occult phrases, and men who whispered about power bought with blood, and the talk moved from the tea stalls to the church and back again. Investigators came sometimes, and they counted victims and took notes, and they wrote down names and dates, but the answers the town needed never arrived cleanly, and doubt grew like mold. Some said a group calling itself the Superior Universal Lineage had members in towns beyond ours, and its teachings about children frightened everyone who heard the words. Valentina de Andrade's name floated in our mouths, spoken like a bone placed on a doorstep, because papers and prosecutors linked that figure and her doctrine to accusations in court. I saw a poster on a wall in the town square asking anyone with information to come forward, and I saw faces pass by without stopping, eyes lowered like people carrying too much. The press arrived and wrote headlines, and reporters asked questions about occult motives and organ theft, and their cameras recorded mothers who could not sleep. At one funeral, I watched a father place a small shoe in the grave and then try to bury his quiet mouth with both hands, as though silence could pull the boy back. Doctors testified later in other towns that some wounds were consistent with sharp instruments, surgical skill sometimes suspected, and the talk of professional involvement made the horror colder. We heard that some doctors who had recently moved to the area were questioned, and the record shows that investigators at least once detained medical men for clarification. Families accused powerful men, and when names were shouted in the market, the mood flipped from grief to rage, and the police had to separate men who would fight for answers from men who wanted to hide. Witnesses gave statements that sometimes changed when told by others, confusion spreading because grief and fear make memory brittle, and the courts later struggled with contradictions that could not be smoothed. Some suspects were arrested and tried, some convicted, and years later some sentences were appealed or altered, leaving a legacy of courtroom dust where justice should have been shining. I remember nights when neighbors walked in pairs, the elders carrying long poles, the children kept indoors, and every distant footstep made the whole house hold its breath. Rumors of ritual language, symbols carved into earth, and strange offerings showed up at the edges of our fields, and people began burning salt at thresholds, believing small rites could protect a child. Some survivors later described being lured with sweets or promises of work, and their voices shook when they told how attackers looked and what they smelled like, details that haunt me. The news sometimes called it cult violence, sometimes occult homicide, and each phrase shaped public terror differently, while families waited for answers that courts could not always give. Human rights groups later criticized the investigations as flawed, pointing to missing autopsies, poor evidence handling, and gaps that allowed doubt to overshadow some prosecutions. Those flaws left scars in the community, because when evidence is lost, the story smears and victims' families must carry that absence as a new wound. I attended community meetings where lawyers said complicated words about proof and procedure, and I watched parents nod with faces empty from hope deferred. Some trials drew national attention, headlines, and public outrage, and some accused stood in courtrooms while cameras watched, their eyes hidden behind lawyers' files. The sect's alleged ideology, as reported by investigators, warned against the innocence of children, claiming twisted doctrines that made young ones into instruments of a violent fantasy. That doctrine, if true, helped explain why some men believed mutilation could produce power, but doctrine cannot stand alone in a courtroom, and proof must be forensically clear. Several defendants were convicted in local courts, and the sentences ranged harshly, while others saw acquittals later, and communities argued about whether justice had been served. I remember the eyes of one mother when the verdict came. She did not rise to clap or shout. She only folded her hands and closed them as if holding a star that had already fallen. Scholars later warned that moral panic can warp investigations, and they called for rigorous forensic standards to separate atrocity from rumor when emotions are raw. Documentaries and investigative journalists dug up old files, spoke to witnesses, and their shows made new waves in town, reopening wounds but also pushing for clarity. International bodies later pressed for accountability and better protections for children, because the wounds in Altamira echoed beyond our river and into national conscience. Community healers tried ceremonies to comfort the living, civil groups offered counseling, and some schools added lessons teaching children to avoid strangers and speak up if frightened. Memorials sprang up by the river, small stones with names, candles in tins, mothers whispering the boys' names into the night like prayers that would not be answered. Even now I walk past those stones and my feet slow, because memory is a weight that needs to be carried, and the river keeps some of the town's secrets underwater. Those who survive their attacks carry scars and nightmares, and I have seen brave faces falter when a child runs past playing, because fear returns in sudden, sharp ways. Legal debates continued for years, appeals filed, some convictions overturned, and the long arc of justice bent under pressure from both human error and legal complexity. The Superior Universal Lineage controversy linked to other regional cases, and the web of allegations stretched into other towns, making investigators question whether they faced a single monstrous network or overlapping myths. Journalists pieced together court filings that named doctors, local businessmen, and security men as suspects, creating a picture of complicity and suspicion that fractured trust. Families demanded better forensic work, mandatory autopsies, and protected witness statements, because nothing heals grief like truth, even if truth is sharp as a blade. Human rights reports later urged systemic reforms, and advocates pushed for better child protection laws, while some policymakers promised change that took years to arrive. The cases taught us how rumor can turn cruel when institutions are weak, and how vulnerable children become targets when society's watchmen sleep in the wrong hours. Years later, researchers warned about sensational media, urging balance and care in reporting, because headlines can sometimes feed the very panic they aim to expose. I remember the sounds of police cars, the hard shoes on dirt, the hush at funerals, and the ways neighbors stopped meeting as they used to, because grief is contagious and fear is louder than song. Some convictions remained on the books, while appeals layered over them like new dust, complicating closure and leaving many families in suspended sorrow. Activists organized vigils and marches, holding placards with boys' names, and those small protests sometimes sparked pity, sometimes change, and sometimes only momentary attention. Teachers began teaching safety rules more strictly, and parents kept boys closer at dusk, leading to a childhood lived in guarded pockets and limited freedom. Medical testimony about wounds remained central in trials, with experts tracing cuts and burns, and forensic detail that turned horror into courtroom evidence. The public memory of Altamira is a wound still being dressed, a history of grief and contested truth, told in court transcripts and whispered in markets. When I tell this, you must know I do not invent details to frighten you. Each horror here is drawn from reports and investigations documented by newspapers and human rights groups. If you want proof, look to the records, the court files, the investigative reports, and the human rights petitions that pressed for answers across sovereign borders. The river still runs its course, and the children still play, sometimes, but the town learned caution the hard way, and we teach new generations to speak when afraid. I say their names quietly sometimes in the market, And elders nod because each of us remembers someone who never came home again. This is a true story. It happened in Altamira between 1989 and 1993. It involved the kidnapping, emasculation, maiming, and killing of multiple young boys, and the facts are recorded in investigative reporting, court records, and human rights documents.